Hello again, students. In this video we're going to take a look at adding functions to our spreadsheet. In the previous video we used the same spreadsheet that you can see here, and what we did was we added some formulas to our spreadsheet so that we could have our spreadsheet calculate some things for us. And you can see here that in this particular cell I have a formula that takes a series of cell references and adds them all together. And you can see here for the average I have actually a very small formula that takes one particular cell, C10, and divides by a value. So these two formulas find the total and average respectively, and as we mentioned, there are some other ways that we can get our spreadsheet to actually calculate some things as well. And in this video we're going to take a look at that. Over time, people quickly figured out that it would be much easier to perform certain types of calculations by building in some formulas that the spreadsheet itself could evaluate. And as long as we give the spreadsheet the information that it needs, it can perform some calculations for us. And there's many different formulas that are available. Some spreadsheets have more than others, and we're going to be learning some of these formulas as the course progresses, but there's some very basic formulas that we want to take a look at. And for the most part, instead of actually trying to take a look at all of the different formulas that are available, we really want to take a look at how the formulas with the functions are structured so that you understand all the different aspects that go into constructing a function, so that later on, if you decide to do some other work in a spreadsheet and you want to find another function that does something that you need it to do, you'll have a familiarity with how these all work so that you're not thrown by maybe a new requirement that a particular function may have. So we're going to take a look at two particular functions in this particular video, and in some other videos we're going to introduce some other functions as well. And we're going to probably take a look at some other functions a little bit more quickly in the next couple videos. But here we're going to exaggerate this a little bit. So for the first week where we're dealing with formulas and functions, we're just exaggerating things so that you can really digest everything that's being done. And if you have any questions, you can really ask them at this time. Rather than throwing all of these different functions at you at one time, we want to just take a look at some basics, and then next week or in the next couple videos we'll start taking a look at more functions and see how they all work. But today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two functions, and they both just so happen to correspond to the values that we have here in this spreadsheet. So the first value that we have here, this $120.50, was our total for our daily earnings. And I don't know if you recognized it, but in my last video tutorial I tried my hardest not to use the word sum too often. That is actually the word that represents the answer to an addition problem, and that's actually what we were trying to calculate. And the reason why I was trying to avoid that word is because that's actually the word that we can use for a particular function. Most spreadsheets, one of their most basic functions is a sum function, and what it will do is it will add up numbers for you. So I mean, it's called sum, so we should have the expectation that it's going to provide a sum for us. Now the question is, how do we use it? How do we tell the spreadsheet to actually calculate the sum of something? What do we do? Alright, so that's what we're going to take a look at. So I'm going to completely delete that particular cell, and we're going to start fresh. So we're going to start with the equal sign again. Now just because I'm using a function doesn't mean that I start out my formula any differently. I still am asking Excel to perform a calculation, and any time I am asking Excel to perform any kind of calculation or do anything else but display what I'm typing, I need to start with the equal sign. If you don't start with an equal sign, what Excel is going to do is it's just going to display what you type. And And that's not really what you want. So we want it to perform a function. So we're going to type equals, and then we're going to type the name of the function that we want to use. Now, if you look around or you explore your spreadsheet, you may find that there's a lot of different ways that you can enter functions. We're going to start at the keyboard for now, and maybe later we'll take a look at some other ways to actually get some formulas and things into our cells. But for now we're just going to stick with the keyboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type the name sum, and as I start I want you to notice in my particular spreadsheet, and this is true in Excel and others, that when you start typing what looks like the name of a function, the spreadsheets nowadays are trying to be a little bit helpful to you and try to provide you with some suggestions of what you're looking for. And you can see here that I have a list of functions that all begin with S, sign at the top, and then SLN, and then sum, and you can see their sum is exactly what I've been looking for. So I'm going to finish just typing. Some spreadsheets will let you click on that list. Some will not. They're just kind of suggestions for you so that you know how to keep going. And others do even different things. But I want you to notice here that even in all of these options, most of them are formatted in the same way to some extent. They all start with a function name, and as you can see here, I have sum. And then what comes after it is a set of parentheses with some things inside. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what those things are. So you can see over here, though, in my spreadsheet, as I hover over sum, my spreadsheet's kind of giving us some tips on how this particular function works. And if I read it, I can see a little bit about how it works. Now, for the sum, we're probably not going to be too worried about how this works, but as you're looking for other functions to do things, you may want to read on what the function's supposed to do to see if it actually applies to the situation that you're dealing with. In this particular case, you'll notice that the sum inside parentheses has a series of values. You'll see it says number underscore 1, comma, number underscore 2, comma, an ellipsis, number underscore 30. So what this function is telling me, or what the documentation is telling me, is that the sum function accepts a list of values separated by commas, and what it will do is it will add up all of those numbers. And we're going to actually take a look at how this works. So what I'm going to do is start with an open parenthesis. That's what we call it in many aspects of programming and spreadsheet applications, is an open parenthesis, because it's opening a set of arguments. And then what I need to do is provide the parameters for this particular function. And the parameters are basically the things that it needs to do its job. And we saw on the previous screen that it needs a list of values separated by commas. That's what we call a comma-separated list, or a comma-delimited list. And those of you that are taking programming, you're familiar with that word delimited, because that's a term that we use in programming as well. So what I want to do is I want to provide the sum function with a list of values separated by commas. So the first value I'm going to pick is the first value in my list, which is C4. So I'm going to type C4. And I'm not going to do what we did in the last video. I'm not going to actually use that value because, as you know already, instead of using the literal value 14, we want to use the cell reference. And I actually want to make sure I get the cell reference right, C5. So I want to make sure that I use that cell reference so that my spreadsheet actually knows not to use the literal value, but to go inside of that cell and pick out the current value at the time. Interestingly enough, if I had left it C4, I probably would have gotten some error because the label earned is obviously not something that the spreadsheet can use in a calculation. So then I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to put C6, comma, and then I could do what I did in the last video. I could click here, and you'll see C7 is added, then comma C8, comma C9, and since that's the last value, what I'm going to do is close the parenthesis. Some spreadsheets will allow you to ignore that last parenthesis, but I always think it's a good idea to make sure that you get it in there. And then if we have done this right, what we've told our spreadsheet to do is to take the sum of C5, C6, C7, C8, and C9. Let's see what happens. Take a look. There is our sum. And you notice if I do go ahead and change a value, I'm going to change this to $21, then yes, my total changes as well because I used the cell references. So that's a nice little handy function. Now, you might be thinking, well, sure, the spreadsheet added all of those values for us, but, you know, it really wasn't that much different than what I had done before. I mean, am I really benefiting from using the formula? I still had to type every single cell reference. I still had to type a comma in between each one. In fact, there's more typing involved here than there was when just adding this up. And I would agree with you. In this particular case, it was probably easier to use the formula that I used before. However, there is something that we didn't necessarily see in that little tip before. Instead of actually listing values one by one, separated by a comma, what most spreadsheets allow us to do is actually represent a range of cells. If you have a range of cells that are all right next to each other, they are adjacent, one right after another, either in the same row or in the same column, or even in a collection of rows and columns, the spreadsheet will allow us to actually refer to all of those cells as a particular range. I'm actually going to show you how to do that now. If I go in and I delete this formula, and I start over again, I want to show you a little trick. In many cases, after you have opened your parentheses, if you take your mouse and you highlight, you click and drag, and highlight the cells you actually want to use in that particular formula, the spreadsheet will add those values in. And instead of telling you how this worked, I wanted you to actually see what was going on. The spreadsheet, you notice, instead of putting C5, C6, all the way down to C9, it used a colon to separate the first value and the second value. So it's basically saying C5 to C9. And that's what we call a range of cells. And reading the colon as the word to is not new to us, especially for math. When we deal with ratios, we would read that 2 as well. And here I'm dealing with a range of C5 to C9. So if I use that range, instead of adding each one individually, Excel, or whatever spreadsheet you're working with, I'm actually not working with Excel, I'm working with Google Sheets, that will calculate the range of those cells. Now you might be thinking, well, what if all of the cells are not exactly right next to each other? Well, in that particular case, you're going to have to use those commas. You might have a group of cells that are right next to each other, and you can group those together in a range. But then you might also have another series of cells that are not exactly right next to each other, so you can list those individually. You'll see over time how you can get tricky with the listing of all of those values. But it's important to note that not only can we list values individually, we can also specify a range of values using this notation. Alright, so that's the sum function. Now, once you understand the basic foundation of working with functions, many of them are now easy to pick up. So for example, this particular calculation was for an average. In many applications, spreadsheet applications, there is an average function, and you'll notice here I'm getting a clue that there is average. And you notice it's structured the same way. All it needs is a list of values separated by commas. So I'm going to actually open this up, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to click and drag over that same series of cells, close the parenthesis, and there I have my average. So you can see here that not only did I just use a range of cells, but I didn't even have to count up my values anymore. So those are some functions. In some later videos, we're going to check out some other things as well.